So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Princeton Public Library. My name is Janie Herman. I am the manager of programming here at the library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's author event with Anne Hand, celebrating her new book, Austrian Again, Reclaiming a Lost Legacy. Before we begin, a few quick reminders. Please take a moment now to silence your phones and any other electronic devices. And I also just want to let you know that this room is equipped with a T-coil-enabled hearing loop. If you have a T-coil device, simply switch to the T setting to access enhanced sound. We also have headsets available at the back table by the door if you need to have better hearing. So it's truly a delight to have Anne with us this evening for her book, Austrian Again. It's a beautifully written exploration of identity, belonging, and rediscovery. It's a story that transports readers across borders and through time as it delves into the complexities of heritage and self-understanding. Her keen eye for detail and her evocative prose invites us to reflect on how our past shapes who we become. She's going to be in conversation tonight with, Dr. Timothy Nelson, who is a lecturer in sociology and public policy at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He is the author of numerous articles and books on poverty and low-income fathers, most notably Doing the Best I Can, Fatherhood in the Inner City. He previously has held academic roles at Johns Hopkins University and Harvard. This event tonight is co-sponsored by the West Windsor Arts. Now about Anne. Anne Hand is an accomplished writer whose work has appeared in numerous literary journals and anthologies. With her memoir, Austrian Again, she continues to establish herself as a distinctive and thoughtful voice. After Anne's talk with Timothy, there will be a time for questions from the audience. It'll be followed by a book signing right here in this room. Copies of Austrian Again are available for purchase. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome tonight to our guests.
Thank you.
Okay, so so this book is really, it was beautifully done. I had the privilege of reading it twice, once over the summer and now just more recently. But it really takes you on two different journeys. One is a personal journey into your family history, and then another is kind of the journey as you navigate the bureaucracy of a foreign country in a foreign language to try to figure all of that stuff out. But I wonder if you could take us back to the very beginning of that journey when you're on your computer and you see something in The Guardian, and just take us back to like what it felt like when you saw this headline.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And now that, and just, before I go into it, just thank you so much to everybody who's here. This is incredibly exciting. The book's been out for a few weeks now, and everybody's just been so positive and welcoming, and it's just so lovely to, feel this love and this reception for something that's, been a long project and certainly a labor of love. So thank you to everybody for coming out and sharing it, and thank you, Tim, for, reading an early copy and blurbing it and just being so supportive with all of this. Thank you. Sure. Thank you so much. So when I was just at my computer, this was kind of early in the pandemic, maybe September, I think, 2020. And, I was reading the news like I do every morning. And, when you read the news, you read the international press, you never really think that there's anything that you're going to see that actually is going to impact your life very directly. You want to know what's going on in the world and sort of keep informed as a person who cares about what's going on in the world. But I saw this headline that Austria was going to start opening this process to reclaim citizenship for the descendants of people who were victims of the Nazi regime, the Austrofascist regime, the Holocaust, World War II, kind of more broadly. And I was like, because, I knew that we had a little bit of that family story. I knew that my great-grandmother had been very lucky to get out of Vienna in mid-1938. I knew that, my grandfather passed away when I was 11, and he had come over to the U.S. earlier. He came over in the 1920s, and, he was very proud to have been from Vienna, even if it was in a time and a place where he couldn't stay. He had to leave to have more opportunities and the chance to build a life, where he could reach his potential in a way that Austria and Vienna of the time never would have let him for a variety of reasons. So, I see this headline and I'm just like, okay, this is interesting. We have a connection. I don't know what this means. I don't know where it's going, but I think I'm curious to kind of dig a little bit and find out more. And then, in a way, maybe because it was during COVID, it was that first COVID winter, and I had time, and we had this box of family stuff at home that nobody had really gone through before. It's a lot easier now to do this kind of research remotely. Like before, you would have had to go to archives, and you would have had to, really try hard to find this stuff. And a lot of it's available on Ancestry also, for anybody who'd be looking for it. So, that first moment, Tim, that you're referring to is just it was curiosity, and then very, very quickly I found out that the process itself, in a way, was going to be easier than I thought, but in another way, was going to be harder than I thought.
Okay. So you mentioned the box. So, which is really, if you were scripting this, it's like a really dramatic thing. Like, if you see a movie or a TV series, there's often the discovery of what's in the box, right?
Yeah.
And you have a section that describes this, right? Do you want to go ahead and read that?
Yeah, sure. So this is from the first part of the book where I'm kind of talking about, the family research and this whole process. The late autumn Massachusetts sun became fainter as the afternoon passed, turning to winter. I could accomplish little in the outside world as a pandemic with no end in sight made all in-person activities feel like a leap of faith. So I began to organize, spreading out the material across a small quadrant of the old living room carpet. First, I made separate piles. The things I recognized, the copies of photographs I had seen in our photo albums or my grandparents, were easy and went in one pile. There were some small booklets with dates. Transatlantic crossings from 1923, 1938. The passports, of course, but only from 1938. Letters, some dated, some not, mostly from 1938. An old Morocco leather accordion file, just the right size for a passport or two. Some original documents on legal-size paper, some certified copies, all in German. And so many photographs, black and white, then color, of people I did not know. I separated the story I knew from the one I did not, the color from the black and white, like it was the Wizard of Oz. In color, there was life I recognized in a flow. I saw my great-grandmother, wrapped in blankets, smiling dreamily, lounging in the same muted Northeast American winter sun. I saw my great-aunts on their retirement world tours and recognized Jerusalem and Yafo, where I had also once been, as well as their home at the time in California, with friends. There was a photo of my great-grandfather's grave in color, which they must have taken on that trip back to Vienna, and odds and ends that were thrown into the box for reasons I cannot decipher, and multiple photographs from the 1930s of a dog named Petey. Sifting through the box was a weighty task, even without being able to read the letters written during the interesting times that had cursed them. I started and stopped, piled and repiled, taking things in and out, unsure how to proceed. I let it sit for a day, a few days, a week, then came back to it, drawn like a moth to the flame for reasons I could not say, but that left a gnawing uncertainty. I took pictures of the letters because they were too delicate to put through the one-page-at-a-time travel scanner I had available. The old photos were sturdier, and I scanned some of them. I tried to create order, divide, without becoming too rigid in my characterization because I did not know if my excavations were uncovering a new species or just an extension of something I already knew about. I went in circles in my head about everything inside the box. What could it mean, this box that opened up worlds that I had no idea existed? I had no context for much of its contents. I had the broad strokes narrative of more immediate family who were present and accounted for, but there were so many more people whose faces shone with hope and life and were completely unknown to me. Most of those faces seemed unrelated to the well-trodden stories I knew.
So 1938 turns out to be a very significant year. It's the year that they emigrated. And just to put it all in context, what else happens in 1938 in Austria?
So in March 1938, Austria was annexed by the Nazi regime, by Nazi Germany. That it was called the Anschluss, and that was really, one of the first big steps that Nazi Germany took to kind of, reach out and kind of see how far they could go, before it turned into all-out war, if you will. It was a very smooth process for Nazi Germany. Most of the Austrian government officials just said, basically, hey, okay, and they basically, very quickly, the Nazi apparatus came in, just took over where the Austrian government apparatus had been, and the same Nazi policies that had been developing in Germany for 5 years, I believe, at that point, were basically sort of superimposed onto Austrian society and Austrian life. At the time, there were about 200,000 Jews in the country, about 90% of which were in Vienna, the capital. And my family was still there. My great-grandmother and my youngest great-aunt, they were still living there, even though my grandfather and his 2 older siblings were already in the U.S. at that point. So, what I found from family letters was that, first, nobody expected this to happen. There was some sort of, high-level family political talk, but nobody expected any of this to happen. And then from there, it was just, it was just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of chaos. And, my family was very, very lucky that they were in a position where literally the week before the Anschluss, so there'd been a lot of back and forth over the years about my family in the U.S., my grandfather and his siblings wanting my great-grandmother and their youngest sister to leave. Because the things were getting bad for a long time, because economically it wasn't sustainable anymore, because a lot of things, but they didn't want to leave. They didn't want to leave. They had their life there. They had the family liquor store and bar there. They had enough to kind of keep going with remittances that came from the kids in the U.S. as well. They had enough with that, and it's a certain point, and I'm not quite sure where it is, but they had basically convinced my great-grandmother and my great-aunt to, just file the paperwork, get it in there, and get going. And we learned this from family letters that were in this box that we've since donated to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. But they went into the U.S. Embassy in Vienna for their visa appointments a week before the Anschluss. And, so that, they were incredibly lucky, and there's no other way for me to think about it, at least. They were not wealthy. They did not have the resources to bribe people. They just did not have anything that you kind of start to read about when you hear about the chaos that ensued in Vienna for people who realized that they needed to get out. And they were very lucky that they were already in the queue, basically. Their paperwork was in, they were going to get filed away, they were going to get everything approved, and it's also very interesting, I think, to think about, how quickly their visas actually did come through. So they had their paperwork in, I believe, March 7th or something like that. The Anschluss was March 12th. By mid-May, their visas were approved. These are timelines that really, I don't think ever happened for the U.S. anymore. I've never heard of anybody with an immigration, in the line for, green cards, basically, get approved in 2 months like that. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there are people who do, but I have a lot of friends who have lived internationally, and I've never heard of it. And then, 2 or 3 weeks after their green cards were approved, they were out. And there was no looking back. There was nothing. It was just okay, we're gone. So 1938, and that was my family's story. If you want to read about what happened in Vienna and Austria from a more historical perspective, there's a lot that's been written about it. There's a lot about, another great example is the case of the Freud family, where, Sigmund Freud was able to get out. I think he left a week before my great-grandmother did, but, it was also a case where he had to sign away everything to the Nazi regime, and he still wasn't able to get his extended family out. And every single family that lived through that tried to get out, that could or couldn't. Some people might have been able to get out, some people might not have been. It's all it becomes this incredibly chaotic vision and version of life, where some people were very lucky and some people were not. And the way that the regime then just sort of went in, and these policies that took basically 5 years, these incredibly racist, anti-Semitic policies that they took a long time to evolve in Germany. They were then superimposed in Austria very, very quickly, with a Jewish population that really didn't see this coming.
So in that, take you back to the box.
Yeah.
You discover these photographs of these people you have no recognition of, and the names that you've never heard before.
Yeah.
And so this kind of latches on to another theme of the book that I think that leaves your personal, and one thing that all good books do is you've got the personal there, but it really connects to some larger, even more universal themes. And I think the theme of family and family remembering, I mean, one thing that comes through is like, although these were not really suppressed, they were kind of hidden from you. Like these, so tell us about the photographs of the boys that you uncover, and then how did you find out who they were and what happened to them?
Yeah, so there were a lot of photographs where I just didn't, they were old photographs from the 20s and 30s. They must have been saved for some reason. I don't know what that reason was. Now I know. I didn't know at the time. And a lot of them were unlabeled also. So that's the part that's a little hard, where these photographs were saved for a reason, but you don't really have a place to start from. You don't have a place to look. And there was one boy there were 2 photos of him, one when he was about like 8 or 10 or so, and another when he was about 13. And that was like the one name that I kind of had to go on, which was Hans Fischer. My great-grandmother's maiden name was Fischer, so I figured it was a cousin of some sort, nephew, I don't know. And her whole family was from this sort of tri-border area. Now it's a tri-border area. When they were all in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was no border. It was just, a nexus of people and languages and all of that. So it's very close to what's now the tri-border area between Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. Within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, after the kind of mid-1800s, there was freedom of movement. People traveled for work, for business, in ways that, as I was learning about this, just felt very contemporary, right? Because now you have the EU, and now people can do that again. But after the breakdown of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was a long period where the people put up borders, and even if the families were sort of separated into different countries, what became different countries, there was just this, people still tried to keep in touch. People still tried to visit, even when it was harder. People still tried to keep those connections alive. And in the case of Hans Fischer, there was this whole, my grandfather had been born, which I didn't realize. He told us he was born in another part of Czechoslovakia, but he had been born in the same sort of 3-border area. And in what's now outside of the 3rd largest city in the Czech Republic, Ostrava. And so once I had the name Hans Fischer, Ostrava was on the pictures. I was like, okay, it's a very clear family connection here. And I was able to find the name, and his was the only name I was able to find in a database from Yad Vashem. When after the Nazis, then took over Czechoslovakia, then invaded Poland, one of the first things that they did, as they were trying to just basically pull Jews out of the areas where they wanted to live, was they basically had these kind of pilot projects to kind of see what happens. There were no death camps yet. None of this was ever, I don't think anybody saw the death camps coming in the way that they ended up evolving. But in the case of my family, because they lived in this tri-border region, the Nazis chose, basically an easy deportation plan. 10 miles train, taking the train 10 miles, you're over into occupied Poland. There a lot, all bets are off in occupied Poland, And what they did was they created these just basically sort of fenced-in camps, and they shipped over, these trainloads of Jewish men, and they said, okay, go. And it's October, November, and it's getting cold, and nobody has any food, nobody has anything for the winter. They just, ship them over the border on a train and see what happens. So that was called the NISCO plan. I had no idea that this existed before I started doing all this. And the one family name that I was able to find was a cousin, nephew, who was shipped on one of the first deportation trains when he was 17. And you realize, like, okay, I never thought of my family as related to the Holocaust. Because everybody was out when things got bad. Everybody was already here. Everybody, I would have still been born. And then you start to dig, and you don't even have to dig really far to find these stories where it's not even like far-flung extended family. It's very close extended family that they loved and they cared about. And for whatever reason, for my great-grandmother, my great-aunts, nobody passed these stories down. Nobody said what happened to the whole, all these cousins, all these aunts and uncles who literally, just disappeared from the historical record at a certain point. And you can, I found one name. I said, okay, like, I'm just going to assume that what happened to him, happened to everybody, because I have no reason to think otherwise. And when you realize, like, okay, this is my history, this is my story, even if I didn't grow up with this idea of victimization, of, the camps, nobody in my immediate family was in the camps or anything like that, but you start to understand, I think, just the level of just societal destruction that happened in a way that I don't think necessarily happens, in Holocaust education if you focus on the camps, the death camps, or if you focus on, the Nazi apparatus, or you focus on these different pieces. Really what happened was, an entire extended society was completely destroyed. And in that case, yeah, like, they were Holocaust victims, and, and they chose to tell the story in a way, I think, that allowed the future generations, to move forward the best that they could. But I don't know, there's always something that makes you think and makes you kind of look back a little bit. And it's important to really understand it. And I didn't understand that before doing this. So, getting back to this ambivalence maybe that there was initially about, the Austrian restoration citizenship, were we victims? Should we apply? All this stuff. And when you realize that, not only was the entire, an entire, group of people, an entire, ethnic group victimized, whether they wanted to consider themselves victims or not, the fact that one of the countries that until recently hadn't taken any responsibility for it is now saying, okay, we're going to open our doors and say we made a mistake, and you don't have to come back. That's your choice. That's an individual choice. If you want to, do this restoration citizenship thing, but it's there. That seemed really, really powerful to me.
So, so as you started going down this journey, and you're learning things about your own family, and obviously the larger history of what's happening in that part of the world. So I'm interested, so your mother is kind of going along this journey with you, maybe somewhat reluctantly, like,
Yeah.
So that's kind of the sense I got in the book. I don't know if you want to say more about that.
I mean, she'll say it herself. She always says she wouldn't have done it if I didn't kind of pull her along. So, but I feel really fortunate that in the end she did go along for the ride, and she was very supportive.
To the point where when the, not to give away the end, but when the papers come through, right, she accompanies you to New York. So I know you have a section of the book there.
Yeah, and I mean, I feel like the title of the book is kind of a spoiler, So it's a little, the title says it all. So, not really giving anything away except everything that's already. So this is the section from the chapter where we went to New York from Boston to finalize our paperwork. Then, before we were fully mentally prepared for it, we were at the converted townhouse on 69th Street, just a block away from Central Park, with the red and white striped, blue and yellow starred flags outside. If we hadn't known it was a consulate, it might as well have been yet another fancy doctor's office or a discreet legal firm. The red brick facade with white framed windows was New York understatement at its finest. We were right on time. I rang the buzzer and said we were there for our appointment. They let us in immediately, since we were the only appointment for that hour due to ongoing COVID protocols. There was a vestibule with security cameras, but no metal detector, no x-ray machine, none of the full-blown security apparatus that I had experienced trying to enter U.S. embassies or consulates abroad that may deter attacks but also make regular people feel phenomenally unwelcome and insecure. The Austrian consulate, on the other hand, felt surprisingly accessible. We did not have to wait for long, just a minute or two, until the diplomat who was our point of contact since we first submitted our applications came out to greet us warmly and get on with the paperwork. He was much taller than I had expected. If we were shorter than he expected, he did not let on. He was friendly and welcoming and seemed happy that we were there. He explained what we would be doing for the next hour. First, we would be formally finalizing the citizenship process, and then we would apply for passports and other documents. First would be my mother, and then it would be my turn. He would help us out with everything. My mother asked if she could show him something before we got started. Of course, he said, calm and patient, but with his eyes crinkled in a befuddled manner. It seemed like he was used to people coming in and wanting to move forward to finish their paperwork as quickly as possible. I reached into my backpack and took out the envelope of pictures that had come from the box. My mother wanted to present her grandmother, the reason why we were here in the first place, to this man, this stranger, this reverse gatekeeper. There she was, in front of the liquor store and bar that had reached such family renown, with her dog, Petey, in Vienna. There she was on the boat over. There she was in the U.S., with my mother as a child. The small pieces of my great-grandmother's life that we still had accessible, from the last third of her time on Earth, which all went in a way that she could never have predicted as a girl in a small Slovakian border town. There were few pictures, but my mother slowly shuffled through them, smiling at the memories she had and the dreams that those memories had stirred up. The tall consular officer was kind and patient, but, as a bureaucrat is wont to do, after some murmurs that showed his polite interest, he got us on with the business at hand. The official reason we were scheduled for a significant amount of his time that morning did not include looking at old pictures. And then, suddenly, we were Austrian. First my mother, and then I, signed the last of the paperwork in front of him to verify that we were formally Austrian. He gave us our cream and yellow official notification documents in formal red and white folders. It took a little while longer, but we filled out the other applications for passports, identity cards, and certificates of citizenship. At a window in the same room, they took our fingerprints for the passports, and we paid the fees in exact bills, cash only. It took longer than we'd expected, a bit more than the full hour they'd allotted for us. I could understand why the consular officer wanted to move on. As we finished, another woman came in for her appointment. She had come to Manhattan for the day from Long Island with her daughter. It made me nostalgic for the day trips into the city, coming in on the commuter rail for lunch in a museum that I used to take when I was sleeping over at my grandparents' house. We chatted with her a little bit as we were wrapping up. She was the me for her family. She was the one who put everything together, who pulled everyone along who wanted to take this journey. I guess every family who goes through a process like this needs to have a person like that, getting everything in order, keeping tabs on how things are going, making sure the flow continues. We finished up so she could take her turn to become Austrian.
So that's not the end of the story, though. There's more after that. And so I think interesting, as you point out, one of your first instincts as a newly minted Austrian citizen is like, I got to vote. So, and so you start pursuing that, talking to people, like doing due diligence and so on.
Figuring out the paperwork. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So you did vote, right?
Yeah. And actually it's funny. So we get this form, right? Like, and it's a very simple form. It's 2 pages. It's in German, but the Google Translate filter on the phone works really well now. So I'm looking at the form, and it's like it's just a voter registration form, but they have 15 questions, and so the first question, because it's basically trying to figure out like where to register you, like what district basically to register you in. And so the first question is, I have lived in Austria, and this is my old address. No. My parents have lived in Austria and continue to live in Austria, and this is their address. No. My spouse is Austrian, and this is his address. No. I worked in Austria, and this was my address. No. And so, I go down this list of like 14 different questions until you get to the last question, which is basically like, well, then why are you registering to vote? But yeah, so on question 15, I had to put down, my family fled the Nazis in 1938. This was their address. So I'm registered at the address that they fled from, which is also really weird and crazy, right? Like, it's the address where my grandfather grew up. It's the address that, basically they were just like, okay, like, we're out. Like, we're not coming back. There's nothing to come back to. And I am registered in that district. And I feel like it's a very American thing to do. I mean, there are parts of this process where I was like, wow, like, I'm really American, like, I get to vote. Like, I want to vote. Let me vote. Let me do all the voting I possibly can do. And when I told some European friends that I could register to vote, they were kind of like, well, why? Why would you want to register to vote? And it's like, because you vote. That's what you do, right? Like, that's your duty. That's your civic obligation. But, you start to see these things where you're like, okay, even if, maybe there are things about the way you grew up, or you had immigrant parents or grandparents, and you're kind of like, there are things about the way I grew up where I don't feel like I'm mainstream, American. Like, to me, when I was growing up, that was always like the kids who went to school with like white bread sandwiches with like mayo and bologna and cheese. Like, that was I don't know why, but that
was me. But
that was you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to be just as American as you are. That to me was, that was American. And my tuna fish and, salami and these kinds of other things, even though my parents were both born in the U.S. too, that was still the food that we ate at home. And so you start to realize, like, even if there are these things from childhood, right, because of my own background or because of my own, upbringing and the way that the things that my parents just like didn't really question, or, they just did the things that their parents did. And there really are some things that make me very, very American. And the voting thing, I think, was one of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so the more you become connected to another country, the more you realize how you've been shaped by the place that you grew up.
Yeah, and these values of, real access and equity that I think I probably internalized a lot growing up. And they're still incredibly important to me. And I think that's in a way like the promise of America, and not just the U.S. as America, but like Americas, like all of the Americas, where you can kind of have, these people, and, different countries have different ways that they frame it, but pretty much every country in the Americas has absorbed immigrants, has, figured out a way for that to shape the national identity, and it's a very different dynamic than a lot of the rest of the world. And having worked a lot, like, throughout the Americas, I think I see those similarities, a lot more clearly.
So in a sense, what Austria did was a very minor form of reparations. And speaking about our country, have you thought more about, like, what does that concept mean in the U.S. and other kind of contexts?
Yeah, and Austria is it's kind of interesting because they gave monetary reparations after World War II. They had to, and so did Germany. And so as I was doing all this digging and finding all this archival stuff that I had no idea existed, documents that we got from the Austrian National Archives had, all of the stuff about my grandmother's liquor shop. So it had, the seizure. It had what they called the Aryanization, what the Nazis did to all the property of Jews to basically, confiscate it and give it to, party members. And so there was that, and then there was the sort of secondary piece of documentation there, whenever. So the Aryanization paperwork was up until like 1940, and then starting in like 1957, there was paperwork about restitution for the shop. And it wasn't that much. It was about $15,000 when you convert it into today's money. But, it was more than nothing, so fine, they got something. So they had already done financial reparations. What they did not do was provide a route for citizenship, because Austrian citizenship law is generally very, very strict. And for the most part, if you take on another nationality, you lose Austrian citizenship automatically. And that's been the way they've done citizenship law for a long time. So in a way, this, sort of opening like a carve out, basically, for restitution citizenship is something that was very, very different for them, very different from the way that they consider citizenship and belonging. But, I think it's a much more genuine way of saying, we were wrong. Like, we should not have done this. And if you want, the door's open. You don't have to come through, but the door's open. And in the US, it's sort of the opposite, right? Like, the 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship to everybody born on US soil. All the slaves, all the descendants of slaves. And then you have the whole, 100 years after of this, basically apartheid state in significant parts of the country. But the citizenship piece was never in question. The financial piece is kind of what people are talking about now, right? And, it hasn't really gone anywhere. And so I think that, there are a few sort of like isolated, municipalities that are doing some kind of financial reparations, but they're very, very few and far between. And so I think the sort of inversion of that is really interesting. At this point, it doesn't cost the Austrian government anything except for, time, bureaucrat time to do all of this. The documentation's there. People can access it. People can submit their petitions, and then it goes to this office in Vienna. It's part of the immigration ministry, and they have a specialized group of people that kind of check all this stuff, and they say, okay, yes, or okay, no. But if you're talking about financial reparations in the U.S. for African Americans, for victims of the Japanese concentration camps during World War II, things like that, you're potentially talking about a lot of money, and I guess the conversation is very different first when you're talking about money and when you're not actually forced to do it. So I don't know you probably know more than I do about how all of this is going, the conversation that's happening in the US about reparations. But from my vantage point, I think the inversion is really, really interesting. And I think that, if people are serious about reparations, there's a lot of different ways to do it.
So apart from voting, so now that you are Austrian again, I'm just curious, like, how much of this is embedded in your identity now, or how you kind of see yourself in the world?
That's a great question. I don't speak German.
You're gonna learn?
Probably not. Not in any, real. Because I know what it's like to learn a language with real fluency as an adult, and that's
German's tough.
German's tough, and it's like a 3-year project. You really you have to really do immersion and make sure you don't have a lot of English-speaking friends, and make sure that you're really forced to use the language to actually become fluent as an adult. And even then, you're never going to be as comfortable as you are in the language that you grew up with. So yeah, maybe I'll get to, intermediate German at some point, but I know that I'm not going to have that kind of facility with the language. And I know that, I didn't grow up there. The candy that you ate as a kid, right? That's going to be different. Or the way that you walk through the streets, or the way that you take the subway, or the way that you do things is going to be different. But that doesn't mean that I'm not Austrian, and that doesn't mean that, I don't have an important role to play. And this is something that I think I take very seriously, that, if they're saying, okay, we're gonna create this carve out and we're gonna let people in, whoever they are, wherever they are, just because they were descended from people that we wronged. I mean, you better believe that I'm gonna be there and say, you know what, like, I'm here and I'm a reminder that this should not happen again. And I'm a reminder, like, I can vote for parties that are aligned with, that belief. And I can do my best to, put myself out there and create conversation and create real examples and real, public discourse, that this isn't just stuff that happens on paper. These are things that impact real people. And I think the idea of, diaspora communities are kind of self-defined in a lot of ways, right? Especially a few generations down. But throughout like this book process and just reaching out to people and seeing all the love and all of the support that's come in through this, you start to connect with people with similar family stories and, similar backgrounds and similar just like ways of seeing the world. And you start to realize, okay, like, the diaspora thing is real. Like, even if it's not something that I, would have considered myself a part of necessarily, when you put yourself out there like that, you really start to see the patterns and the shapes, and you see the things kind of form in a different way. And I think it's very, very important because for the most part, these are all people who have been incredibly successful wherever they ended up. And that's something that is just like, it blows your mind, right? Because if, there hadn't been this disruption, there hadn't been this war and this persecution and this racism and this anti-Semitism, there would have been so much more energy just like channeled towards making the world a better place. Because all the people I know who I've met throughout this process, who are kind of in this boat, people, like, there's a lot of teachers, there's a lot of doctors, there's a lot of, just people who choose these professions, and who are educated and who value reading and who value, inclusion and who really, really want to try to make the world a better place than the world they came into. And it's so important that not only is that you can say, like, I'm a reminder that you shouldn't do things like this again, but look at all of these like amazing and wonderful and talented people who are descended from all these people. Like, look at that. Like, that's incredible. And people also need to see that these kinds of ruptures, they're not the end. For people will end up doing fine for the most part, but there is the rupture and there is the trauma, and people grew up in different ways with all of this. And that's important to recognize too.
Okay. So do we open it up for questions at some? I don't want to hog you off for myself. So that's right.
This is fun. This is a great conversation. Are you kidding?
We're running. Oh, wow. We have lots of questions. Okay.
Question and a comment. Question, what kind of documents did you need to submit?
So Austria is actually relatively easy as far as these processes go because they have really, really good archives. So I did a lot more research than I needed to, like a lot more research. We had my great-grandmother's passport, and that was really all we needed. Yeah. If you don't have a passport, you can sort of put together the timeline through U.S. immigration documents that are now public record. After 75 years, all federal documents become public record, which I did not know before starting all this. So if you go on Ancestry and you have an ancestor who immigrated before whatever 75 years ago was, you'll be able to, probably find that person's record.
Are you eligible for health care in Austria?
You have to actually live there and work there. It's not like you just sort of show up and say, hi, can I go to the hospital?
To say, so I'm in the process of doing something similar through Poland. I engaged a Polish law firm because when I spoke to the Polish consul, I did not get a sense of it being an easy process.
Yeah, it's not.
I just think it's interesting in terms of the title of your book, Austrian Again. I don't know if Jews were more integrated or assimilated into Austrian society than Jews were in Poland, but from the use of the word on the Polish consulate website, Polish blood, to my mother having told me that, if you were Jewish, you weren't really considered Polish. It was like a different category. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess there's two really important points there. So Poland doesn't have a restitution citizenship process. Poland has citizenship by descent. Hungary has citizenship by descent. And what that means is that there's not a special carve out for people like my family that were victimized. Germany does have restitution citizenship. So, it depends a lot on the country. It depends where your family immigrated from, kind of where your eligibility lies. And some of the processes are easier than others. Their country, their rules. So, and if Poland thinks about the Holocaust and World War II and victimization very differently than Germany does and then Austria does. And so I think that's also reflected in the way some of these processes are developed and are executed.
Okay, and I'll come back to you. Go back here.
So you grew up in Acton.
I did, yes.
And I know Acton. And your community is a fairly intimate Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
You've got one Reconstructionist congregation.
It's actually unaffiliated.
Oh, it's now unaffiliated.
Oh, the
okay.
Reconstructionist one's in Concord.
But I'm going towards, the sense I get is Shoah education was not a large part of your religious education or your Jewish education growing up in Acton.
It was, actually. But it was and I think this happened to a lot of people, it's a very narrow interpretation of what that is. So it's focused on the Nazis, the rise of the Nazis, the war, and the camps. And it's not necessarily focused on just the vast devastation that World War II engendered for the entirety of Jewish life in Central and Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the rabbi's name, but it's not important here.
Rabbi Mintz. Rabbi Mintz.
That's right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So he was still a student when we moved to Acton. Within your family, it sounds like, and maybe I'm mishearing, there wasn't a lot of discussion of the immigration to the U.S. and the drivers, or is that a misinterpretation of what you were saying earlier?
Well, there was discussion. I mean, it was very clear that my grandfather had immigrated, but he immigrated more for economic reasons. And it's an interesting point, actually, because, he and his siblings, they immigrated in the 1920s basically for economic reasons, but over the course of, maybe a 10-year period, the economic shifted to political and racist and anti-Semitic, reasons. I don't think that was predetermined at all. I don't think anybody really saw that coming. And sometimes people ask, did your family feel persecuted? It's sort of similar to what you're saying about Polish Jews not really being considered Polish. Did your family feel like second-class citizens? And I don't think they would have considered themselves second-class citizens in Austria. I think that if anything, there was the lack of economic opportunity, they would have attributed to class. I don't think they would have attributed it to race in that sense. But at the same time, these issues are so conflated. Race and class is so intertwined in so many different ways, and it looks different in different parts of the world, in different places in history. And I think that oftentimes people, when they're trying to make sense of all that, they pick the rationale that is least damaging. So, class is something you can do something about, right? You can't do anything about race. So if you feel like you're sort of treated as less than, but you want to maintain your dignity, you're going to say, okay, no, it's a class thing and I can work to get out of that. But if it's a race thing, you are who you are, right? So yeah, it's interesting. And I think that these are also, so going back to what you were saying before, these are really difficult concepts to teach to a bunch of 10-year-olds, like it's easier to kind of focus on the bigger things and the things that are more dramatic. But these pieces of like regular life that are still incredibly relevant contemporary issues. They've been going on for a really, really long time. And I think that, personally, I think that kids should be exposed to the complexity and let them understand that it's not always that cut and dry, and it's not always just, the sort of things that, seem like they're made for, the TV or a documentary. It's a lot more, it's a lot deeper, it's a lot more contextual, and when it's bad, it's a lot more insidious.
Okay.
Thanks, Anne.
Thanks, Ariana.
Welcome. I sent you a WhatsApp message while you were talking so that I would remember this. So
Okay, I don't have my phone, so I didn't see it.
that's so I said the more I just loosely quoted you saying something like, the more you connect to another country, the more you realize your own history or culture. I don't remember exactly the words, and I think you said that too, Tim. You kind of echoed it. Given that you've spent most of your adult life after uni in Mexico, I'm curious about some of the overlaps and these bureaucratic processes and your understanding of how becoming Austrian again, how's that inflected through your life in Mexico and your sense of being a migrant in Mexico?
So first, I think that unless you've actually done immigration paperwork for yourself, it's hard to really explain how difficult it is. It's hard to explain the uncertainty. It's hard to explain the stress. It's hard to explain just, how difficult a lot of these processes are, both emotionally and financially, and just in terms of will they let me stay? I don't know. So I think that, for me, a lot of this just hinges on empathy. And so sometimes you have to do something yourself to have more empathy for other people, kind of going through their own version of the thing. I think that all the time that I've spent, particularly working in Mexico, because especially now, a lot of being with digital nomads and stuff, people can go and live somewhere for a while, but still kind of be in their bubbles, and it's hard to, it's hard to break out of those if, and maybe this is why I'm so sensitive about I know it's going to take a long time to learn German because it took a long time to learn Spanish at a working level of proficiency. And until you kind of do something like that, it's a lot of it sounds a lot easier than it is. And even if worst case scenario, I'll just go live with my mom and dad and stay on the couch, even though then I'll be a 40-year-old teenager or something. It's still different. You have something to go back to. And with my family's story, they had nothing to go back to, so they did not look back. They just moved forward. And I think that, that's probably also very difficult to talk about with people who have not experienced it. So I think that that's also why, they didn't want this piece of the puzzle to be kind of passed on. They wanted to just move forward because that, it's not better or worse, it's just different. And it's their reality. It was their reality at that point. So what's the point of belaboring what was lost when they also knew that they had been very fortunate to be able to leave. And I think I take that groundedness in the Austrian piece with me in a different way, and I think it makes me feel a lot more centered, with who I am and how I move through the world. Even if it's complicated, right? And you can sort of get into all the details of okay, this is complicated and this is weird and this is not typical, I guess, for, what a lot of people end up doing or where they end up living or how they end up, navigating their careers or whatever. But I think that, when a lot of the understanding about what you do comes from a really, really deeply rooted place, and it's a very empathetic place, and it's a very values-driven place, that also comes through in the work, and it makes me work better. It makes me do the type of work that I do better. Yeah.
Interesting to hear your story, because I have thought about getting German citizenship, but not seriously, because I actually lived in Germany after the war. My mother was a Holocaust survivor. But a month ago, I had the opportunity to meet a 100-year-old woman in Tenafly, who's from Austria. She escaped on the Kindertransport in '39, and she lived in the same house practically most of her life in Tenafly. She rebuilt her life in America, and she did go back to Austria, but found it somewhat, well, she was not, should I say, not that impressed in terms of residual feelings that there are, because she heard somebody say, "What's she doing here?" And he said, "Oh, it's just some Jew coming back." So obviously, that didn't endear her, although she came to Vienna to give a talk about some topic. Now, there's a oral history of her at the Shoah Foundation, and I also recorded an update of that oral history because my mother was on the Kindertransport, so there was some linkage. So I thought you might find that interesting because it provides you perhaps another dimension through somebody who was 16 or so when she left Vienna and talked about what was going on, her problems of getting a visa, how she actually had to go directly to the SS to get permission and kiss up to them, and they were sort of abusive. So it was a terrible period in history where Austria just simply turned on the Jews. So I thought you might be interested in that.
Yeah, and it's a really great example too. You know, it was an absolutely terrible period in history for people who did absolutely nothing wrong. You know, so and I think also there's been a lot of, you know, more movies, and, you know, I think another great example is Leopoldstadt, the play that, you know, just won a whole bunch of Tonys. There are a lot of different stories that come out of this period, and everybody's story is important.
Okay, so I think we'll just go back over here for one more question.
I was just curious, you know, you talk about Austria opening up citizenship for descendants of people who emigrated, and you describe that as a recognition that they did something wrong. My father left Vienna a year after your grandmother, so he was there during the Anschluss, and he was there during Kristallnacht, and his parents didn't make it out. He came with his brother at age 17. And I'm just curious, without having studied it, I'm very aware that Germany has taken a lot of steps to come to grips with its Holocaust history. And my sense, without having studied it, is that Austria never did anything similar, and that Austria instead viewed itself as the victims of Nazism rather than enthusiastic supporters. And I don't know if you looked into the extent to which, aside from opening up citizenship, Austria has done any of the kinds of things that Germany has done to take responsibility for what it did.
Yeah, so Germany had to. You know, after World War II, that was in the peace treaty. Germany had to completely redo its constitution, redo its education system, redo a lot of these things that, you know, over the past 70 years have basically resulted in a society that takes its role in the Holocaust, its principal role in the Holocaust very, very, very seriously. Austria was not required to do that at the end of World War II, and that's where you start to see the difference. For about 50 years, yeah, like Austria, you know, they gave money, they gave the restitution because they had to as part of, you know, from when they were annexed, but they, you know, the Austrian authorities basically, you know, they did what you're saying, you know, they said, we're victims, and that's it. And this really, to my understanding, this started to change a lot in the 90s. And I don't know if it's sort of a generational thing, you know, the passing of a lot of the people who were much more actively involved as very, you know, gung-ho Nazis once Austria was annexed. They have, you know, change their education curriculum. And you know, it's different, right? Because they have a national education curriculum, so it's easier to make some of these changes. But they include a lot more about Holocaust education. They include a lot more about Austria's role. But these cultural and societal changes take a really long time to trickle down. They really, really do. And so you're talking about maybe 2 generations where they were very actively sort of playing the victim card too, and then it starts to shift maybe a generation ago, and now what you're seeing is a different kind of response. And like I say that, you know, when I say they say that they did wrong and that they are deeply sorry, that's because that's been the messaging from every single Austrian I've spoken to ever since I started all this. Like you know, I was very skeptical and I think kind of cynical at the beginning, and I've been incredibly very gratefully surprised that has not been my experience with at least with, you know, Austrian government officials, with people I've reached out to in Austria. You know, I'll be there in March for an event at the Vienna Jewish Museum, so we'll see kind of what that conversation looks like, because every place is different, and I think the conversation there will be very different than a conversation that we could have here in the U.S.
One of the other things, I know that Germany expresses a basic responsibility to support Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a fundamental precept of the German government. Do you know what Austria's relationships with Israel is and whether it feels a similar responsibility?
Yeah, they do. The most recent example is, you know, for people who are not familiar with Eurovision is a very big deal in Europe. It's a song contest, so it sounds very superfluous, but it's actually a very, very big deal. And Israel participates in Eurovision, and Austria won Eurovision last year. So the thing is that if you win, you have to host it the next year. So with you know, all the stuff going on in Gaza and all that, a lot of countries had threatened to boycott if Israel was allowed to participate. And Austria said, well, if you're going to boycott, we're not hosting. So, you know, they take their responsibility seriously.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation, really eye-opening. Again, the book is wonderful, and I encourage everyone here to consider getting their own copy to read about this. And thank you for, you know, bringing this whole project to light. Until you came and presented this to me as a program, I wasn't aware that Austria was doing this type of reparation. It's very interesting, and maybe people will be encouraged to do the same because of your book. So thank you so much, and thank you for being our conversation partner. And that concludes our program. Thank you.